Henry Blackwell had built walls so high that love couldn't reach him anymore. The CEO who conquered boardrooms couldn't conquer the emptiness where his mother's voice once lived. Tonight, in a small cafe where a waitress named Emily displayed her paintings, he would mock the very hands that had once held him. The masterpiece hanging on the wall carried his mother's signature, Lillian Blackwell. But 20 years of anger had blinded him to everything except his own pain. Subscribe to witness the moment when recognition shatters a man's carefully constructed world. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackwell Industries as Henry adjusted his Italian silk tie, each movement calculated to project the authority that had become his armor. His corner office on the 42nd floor overlooked a city that bent to his will, where every building seemed to bow in acknowledgement of his empire. The mahogany desk before him bore the weight of contracts worth millions, yet none of them could fill the hollow space that had grown larger with each passing year. His reflection in the darkened glass showed a man who had everything: power, wealth, respect. But the eyes staring back held the emptiness of someone who had lost the only thing that truly mattered. The intercom buzzed with his assistant's voice, reminding him of the dinner meeting that would seal another acquisition, another victory in a war he couldn't stop fighting. He straightened his shoulders, pushing down the familiar ache that surfaced whenever the rain fell this hard, the same way it had fallen the night his mother disappeared without explanation, leaving only a note that said she needed to find herself. The elevator descended through floors of his domain, each level representing another year of building walls around his heart, brick by brick, success by success. His reflection multiplied in the polished steel doors, creating an army of Henry Blackwells, all wearing the same mask of indifference that had served him so well in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. The lobby stretched before him like a cathedral of capitalism, marble floors echoing with the footsteps of employees who feared and revered him in equal measure. Outside, his driver waited beside the black Mercedes that had become his chariot through a world where vulnerability was weakness and emotion was liability. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as they navigated through streets that held no memories, no warmth, only the cold efficiency of a life measured in quarterly reports and stock prices. He checked his Rolex, a gift to himself on the anniversary of his first million, and felt the familiar satisfaction of being exactly where he planned to be when he planned to be there. The restaurant his assistant had chosen was beneath his usual standards, a quaint establishment that catered to artists and dreamers rather than the titans of industry he typically dined with. He almost instructed his driver to turn around, to find somewhere more appropriate for a man of his stature, but the rain had worsened, and the thought of searching for another venue felt unnecessarily complicated. The hostess greeted him with the nervous enthusiasm of someone unaccustomed to serving clients who wore watches worth more than her annual salary, her hands trembling slightly as she led him to a corner table. The walls were adorned with local artwork, amateur paintings that spoke of hope and struggle, emotions he had long since buried beneath layers of calculated ambition. The soft lighting cast shadows that seemed to dance with memories he refused to acknowledge, creating an atmosphere that felt uncomfortably intimate after years of sterile conference rooms and impersonal business dinners. He ordered his usual, Scotch, neat, aged 25 years, the same number of years since his mother had vanished from his life, and tried to ignore the way the candlelight flickered like the reading lamp in his childhood bedroom. The business partner he was meeting had been delayed by the storm, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that he couldn't remember the last time he had sat in silence without the distraction of work. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and gentle laughter, sounds that felt foreign after years of boardroom tensions and hostile negotiations. A young waitress moved between tables with practiced grace, her smile genuine in a way that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he refused to name. She paused at a painting near his table, adjusting its position with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of beauty, her fingers gentle against the frame, as if she were touching something sacred. The artwork itself was simple, a landscape of rolling hills beneath a sky that seemed to hold both storm and sunshine. But there was something in the brushstrokes that spoke of longing, of a heart that had known both joy and sorrow. He found himself studying the signature in the corner, though the candlelight made it difficult to read, and felt an inexplicable pull toward the canvas that he immediately dismissed as the result of too much work and too little sleep. The scotch burned his throat in a way that felt cleansing, washing away the strange melancholy that had settled over him like fog rolling in from the ocean. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails that demanded his attention, using the familiar rhythm of business to drown out the whispers of memory that threatened to surface. The restaurant's atmosphere seemed designed to strip away the defenses he had spent decades building, with its warm lighting and intimate spaces that encouraged the kind of vulnerability he had sworn never to show again. He thought of his penthouse apartment, all glass and steel, and carefully curated emptiness, where no photograph or personal item could remind him of the life he had lost when his mother chose her art over her son. The rain continued its assault on the windows, each drop a reminder of that terrible night when he had waited by the door for a woman who would never come home, clutching a drawing he had made for her birthday that she would never see. He finished his scotch and signaled for another, determined to maintain the emotional distance that had served him so well, even as something in this place seemed intent on tearing down every wall he had built. Subscribe to discover how a man's carefully constructed world begins to crumble in the presence of forgotten beauty. Emily Carter moved through the restaurant with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to carry multiple burdens without letting them show, her apron pockets filled with order pads and paintbrushes that represented the two halves of her divided life. The dinner rush had ended, leaving behind the quiet intimacy of couples sharing dessert and business people nursing drinks, while rain painted abstract patterns on the windows. She had been working at Café Luna for 3 years, saving every tip and spare dollar for art supplies, transforming her tiny studio apartment into a sanctuary where canvases leaned against walls like windows, into worlds she longed to inhabit. The painting hanging near table 7 was her latest piece, a landscape born from dreams of places she had never been, but somehow remembered, painted during the long hours when sleep eluded her, and only the movement of brush against canvas could quiet the restless energy in her soul. She had hesitated before asking Marcus, the owner, if she could display her work, knowing that most customers came for the food and atmosphere, not to discover unknown artists struggling to find their voice in a world that rarely listened. The signature in the corner, E. Carter, felt both proud and vulnerable, a declaration of identity in a space where she was usually invisible, just another server bringing food and taking orders. The man at table 7 commanded attention without trying, his expensive suit and cold demeanor marking him as someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. She had served hundreds of wealthy customers over the years, but something about his presence felt different, more isolated, as if success had built walls around him that even money couldn't tear down. His eyes swept over the restaurant with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating an investment rather than enjoying an evening out, and when his gaze fell on her painting, she felt a flutter of nervous anticipation mixed with inexplicable dread. The way he studied the canvas reminded her of art critics she had encountered at gallery openings, their expressions revealing nothing while their minds dissected every brushstroke, every color choice, every emotional truth the artist had tried to convey. She busied herself with clearing nearby tables, stealing glances at his reaction while trying to appear casual, her heart beating faster with each moment he spent examining her work. The painting meant more to her than she could explain. It had emerged during a particularly difficult period when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. And somehow, the act of creating it had felt like coming home to a place she had never been. The landscape depicted rolling hills beneath a sky caught between storm and sunshine, painted with techniques she had learned from studying masters whose work hung in museums she could only afford to visit on free admission days. Every brushstroke carried the weight of her dreams, the hope that someday her art would speak to someone the way great paintings had always spoken to her, reaching across the void between souls to create connection and understanding. She had painted it thinking of her grandmother's stories about the countryside where she had grown up, descriptions so vivid that Emily could almost smell the wildflowers and feel the wind that bent the grass in waves like a green ocean. The colors had come to her in a rush of inspiration that felt almost mystical, as if some unseen hand had guided her brush to capture not just a scene, but an emotion, a longing for belonging that she had carried since childhood. The frame was simple, purchased from a thrift store and painted white to match the restaurant's aesthetic, but she had chosen it carefully, knowing that presentation could mean the difference between being noticed and being overlooked. Her signature in the corner felt like a prayer, a whispered hope that someone would see not just the painting, but the heart that had created it. The wealthy customer's business partner had still not arrived, leaving him alone with his scotch and his obvious impatience, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that spoke of a man unaccustomed to waiting for anyone or anything. Emily approached his table with practiced professionalism, refilling his water glass and asking if he needed anything else, her voice carefully modulated to convey respect without subservience. His eyes barely acknowledged her presence, focused instead on his phone screen where numbers and charts demanded his attention. The digital world that had clearly become more real to him than the physical space he occupied. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when he looked up from the device, as if returning to the present moment caused him physical pain, and wondered what kind of life required such constant vigilance against feeling. The rain had intensified, turning the windows into rivers of distortion that made the outside world look like an impressionist painting, and she found herself hoping that the storm would delay his companion long enough for him to truly see the artwork that hung just feet from his table. There was something in his posture, a rigidity that spoke of old wounds carefully hidden, that made her think he might understand the emotions she had tried to capture in paint and canvas. The restaurant's atmosphere seemed to soften around them as the evening progressed, the harsh edges of fluorescent lighting giving way to the warm glow of candles and table lamps that transformed the space into something more intimate and forgiving. Emily watched from behind the bar as the man continued to study her painting, his expression unreadable but intense, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had no clear solution. She had painted the piece during a period when she felt particularly disconnected from the world, when the weight of working multiple jobs to support her art had threatened to crush the very creativity she was trying to nurture. The hills in the painting rolled away toward a horizon that promised something better, something more, and the sky above them held both the darkness of approaching storms and the golden light of hope that refused to be extinguished. She had worked on it for weeks, adding layers of meaning with each session, until the canvas became a repository for every dream and fear she carried in her heart. The fact that it now hung in a public space, vulnerable to judgment and criticism, felt both terrifying and liberating, like standing naked in a crowded room and daring the world to see her as she truly was. Subscribe to witness the moment when art becomes the bridge between two souls who don't yet know they're connected. Henry's business partner finally arrived, shaking rain from his umbrella and apologizing profusely for the delay, his nervous energy filling the space between their table and the painting that had been quietly demanding Henry's attention for the past hour. Richard Thornton was everything Henry expected from potential business associates: ambitious, calculating, and desperate enough to accept terms that heavily favored Blackwell Industries, his eagerness evident in the way he spread contracts across the table like offerings to a demanding god. The acquisition they were discussing would eliminate another competitor, adding their manufacturing capabilities to Henry's growing empire while destroying the dreams of a family business that had operated for 3 generations. Henry felt the familiar satisfaction of victory before the battle had even begun, the intoxicating rush of power that came from knowing he could reshape entire industries with a signature and a wire transfer. The numbers on the contracts represented more than money. They were proof of his dominance, evidence that he had transcended the vulnerable child who had once waited by windows for a mother who never returned. Richard's voice became background noise as Henry's attention drifted back to the painting, its simple beauty an irritating distraction from the serious business of expanding his empire. The landscape seemed to mock him with its naive optimism, the rolling hills and hopeful sky representing everything he had learned to distrust about human nature and artistic expression. He had grown up surrounded by his mother's paintings, canvases that had covered every wall of their home like windows into worlds that existed only in her imagination, and he had learned early that art was nothing more than an escape from reality for people too weak to face the truth. The memory of her studio rose unbidden in his mind, the smell of oil paints and turpentine, the way afternoon light streamed through north-facing windows to illuminate works in progress that she loved more than her own son. She had spent hours in that room, lost in creative trances that made her unreachable even when she stood right beside him, her eyes focused on some distant vision that he could never share or understand. The painting before him now carried the same self-indulgent romanticism that had characterized her work, the same refusal to acknowledge the harsh realities of a world where survival required strength, not sensitivity. He felt his jaw clench as Richard continued his presentation, the younger man's words about market penetration and profit margins providing a welcome anchor to the practical world where emotions were liabilities and beauty was irrelevant. The waitress appeared at their table again, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, refilling their glasses and asking if they needed anything else with the practiced invisibility of service industry workers who had learned to anticipate needs without drawing attention to themselves. Henry barely glanced at her, his focus returning to the contracts that would secure another victory in his endless war against vulnerability. But something in her posture as she moved away caught his attention. She paused near the painting, adjusting its position with the careful attention of someone who understood its value, her fingers gentle against the frame in a way that suggested personal investment rather than professional duty. The realization that she was likely the artist struck him with unexpected force, adding a layer of pathetic irony to the scene, a waitress playing at being an artist, displaying her amateur work in a restaurant where real business was conducted by people who understood the difference between dreams and reality. He felt a familiar contempt rise in his chest, the same dismissive anger he had felt watching his mother choose her canvases over her responsibilities, her art over her family, her selfish, creative impulses over the son who needed her to be present and reliable. Richard's presentation reached its climax as he outlined the timeline for the acquisition, his voice rising with excitement as he described the efficiency gains and cost reductions that would result from dismantling another family business and absorbing its assets into Henry's corporate machine. The rain continued its assault on the windows, creating a percussion that seemed to underscore the violence of their transaction, the way they were systematically destroying something that had taken generations to build. Henry signed the preliminary agreements with the same mechanical precision he brought to all business dealings, his signature a weapon that could eliminate jobs, close factories, and reduce human dreams to line items on a balance sheet. The Scotch had warmed his blood and loosened his tongue, making him more willing to express opinions he usually kept carefully controlled. And when Richard made some comment about the restaurant's charming local atmosphere, Henry felt compelled to demonstrate his sophisticated understanding of what constituted real art versus amateur pretension. His eyes fixed on the painting with predatory focus, seeing in its simple beauty everything he had learned to despise about artistic expression and the people weak enough to believe in its value. The words came out before he could stop them, loud enough to carry across the quiet restaurant and sharp enough to cut through the gentle atmosphere like a blade through silk. "Look at this pathetic attempt at art," he said, gesturing toward the landscape with the dismissive wave of someone accustomed to having his opinions treated as gospel truth. Some amateur thinks they can capture the complexity of nature with a few brushstrokes and call it meaningful. It's exactly the kind of self-indulgent nonsense that passes for creativity these days. Richard laughed nervously, uncertain whether he was expected to agree or remain silent, while other diners turned to stare at the source of the sudden disruption to their peaceful evening. Henry felt the familiar rush of superiority that came from demonstrating his refined taste and practical understanding of the world, the satisfaction of putting pretentious artistic expression in its proper place. The painting hung there like a wounded animal, its gentle beauty now exposed to the harsh light of his criticism, and he felt a moment of triumph at having stripped away the romantic illusions that allowed people to believe in the transformative power of art. He had learned long ago that beauty was a luxury for people who could afford to ignore reality, and tonight he would remind everyone present that the real world belonged to those strong enough to see through such sentimental deceptions. Subscribe to discover how a single moment of cruelty can shatter more than just an artist's confidence. The restaurant fell into the kind of silence that follows a gunshot, every conversation halting as Henry's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had consumed something precious and irreplaceable. Emily stood frozen near the bar, her face drained of color, as if his criticism had physically struck her, the tray in her hands trembling with the effort to maintain composure while her world tilted on its axis. The other diners stared with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a public execution, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to outrage as they processed the casual cruelty of his assessment. Henry felt a moment of satisfaction at having demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of art, the same intellectual superiority he had wielded in boardrooms to destroy competitors and in courtrooms to crush opposition. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wishing he could disappear rather than be associated with such a public display of arrogance, his nervous laughter dying in his throat as he realized the magnitude of his business partner's social transgression. The candlelight that had seemed so warm and inviting now felt harsh and exposing, illuminating the ugliness of Henry's character in a way that no amount of expensive clothing could disguise. Emily's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, her professional training warring with her human instinct to defend the work that represented months of hope and struggle, countless hours of pouring her soul onto canvas in the desperate belief that someone might understand what she was trying to say. The painting had been her attempt to capture the feeling of belonging she had never quite found, the sense of home that existed somewhere beyond the horizon of her current circumstances, and hearing it dismissed as pathetic felt like having her heart torn from her chest and displayed for public ridicule. She had known the risks of displaying her work in a public space, had prepared herself for indifference or polite dismissal, but nothing had prepared her for the casual viciousness of someone who seemed to take pleasure in destroying what others had created with love. The signature in the corner, E. Carter, now felt like evidence of her foolishness rather than a declaration of artistic identity, a reminder that she had dared to believe her voice mattered in a world dominated by people like the man at table 7. Her hands shook as she set down the tray, the simple act of remaining upright requiring every ounce of strength she possessed, while around her the restaurant slowly returned to its previous conversations, the moment of drama fading into uncomfortable memory. Marcus, the restaurant owner, appeared at her side with the protective instinct of someone who had watched her struggle and grow over the past 3 years. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in her devastated expression. He had given her permission to display her paintings not out of charity, but because he recognized genuine talent when he saw it. And watching her work dismissed so cruelly by someone who clearly knew nothing about art or humanity made his blood boil with righteous anger. The painting had drawn compliments from dozens of customers over the past month, people who stopped to study its gentle beauty and ask about the artist, and he had watched Emily's confidence grow with each positive response, her smile becoming more genuine as she began to believe in her own worth. Now that fragile confidence lay shattered on the floor like broken glass, and he felt personally responsible for encouraging her to make herself vulnerable to this kind of attack. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering words of comfort that felt inadequate against the magnitude of her pain, while his eyes burned with the desire to confront the arrogant businessman who had turned his restaurant into a battlefield where dreams went to die. Henry returned his attention to the contracts before him, dismissing the emotional aftermath of his criticism as irrelevant to the serious business of expanding his empire. But something nagged at the edges of his consciousness, like a splinter working its way deeper into flesh. The painting continued to hang on the wall, its gentle beauty now somehow more pronounced in the wake of his attack, as if his words had stripped away any pretense and revealed the raw honesty of the artist's vision. Richard attempted to resume their discussion of market projections and acquisition timelines, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone trying to pretend that nothing significant had happened, that the casual destruction of another person's dreams was simply the cost of doing business in a world where only the strong survived. The scotch that had tasted so smooth earlier now burned Henry's throat like acid, and he found himself unable to focus on the numbers that usually commanded his complete attention, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the landscape that seemed to pulse with wounded life. The rain against the windows had intensified, creating a rhythm that matched the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat, and he felt an inexplicable urge to look more closely at the painting, to examine the brushstrokes and color choices that had somehow survived his verbal assault. The signature in the corner caught his attention as he rose from his chair, ostensibly to visit the restroom, but actually driven by a compulsion he couldn't name or understand, his feet carrying him toward the painting despite his conscious desire to leave this place and its uncomfortable emotions behind. The candlelight flickered across the canvas, creating shadows that seemed to dance with memories he had spent decades trying to forget. And as he drew closer, the brushstrokes revealed themselves to be more sophisticated than he had initially assumed. There was something familiar about the technique, the way colors blended into each other with the confidence of someone who understood light and shadow, form and space, in ways that spoke of formal training or natural genius. His eyes focused on the signature with laser intensity, the letters swimming slightly in the dim light until they resolved into clarity that hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The name written in careful script wasn't E. Carter, as he had assumed, but something that made his world stop spinning, made his breath catch in his throat, made 25 years of carefully constructed defenses crumble like sand castles before an incoming tide. The signature read, L. Blackwell, Lillian Blackwell, his mother's name written in the same flowing script he remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists, from love notes tucked into his lunchbox, and signatures on permission slips for school trips she would never attend. Subscribe to witness the moment when a man's entire reality shatters with the recognition of a signature that should have been impossible. Henry's hands trembled as he held the painting, his eyes tracing every delicate brushstroke that had once seemed so amateur, so beneath his notice. The signature in the corner, L. Blackwell, burned into his vision like a brand, each letter a dagger twisting deeper into his chest. His mother's maiden name, the name she had returned to after leaving his father, after leaving him. The cafe around him seemed to dissolve into a hazy blur as memories crashed over him like violent waves against a crumbling shore. He remembered her hands, always stained with paint, always creating something beautiful, while he dismissed her art as a frivolous hobby. The irony was so cruel it made him physically ill. He had spent 20 years searching for her, hiring private investigators, following false leads, and here she was, her soul captured in oils and canvas, hanging in a place he would never have thought to look. Emily watched him with growing concern, her heart racing as she witnessed the complete transformation of the man who had been so cruel just moments before. His face had gone ashen, his usual commanding presence crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. She could see the recognition dawning in his eyes, the terrible understanding that was reshaping everything he thought he knew about the world. The painting had been her most treasured possession, a gift from the mysterious woman who had become like a second mother to her during those dark months when she had nothing. Lillian had appeared in her life like an angel, offering not just the painting but wisdom, kindness, and a belief in Emily's own artistic abilities that no one else had ever shown. The older woman had spoken often of a son she had lost, not to death, but to pride and ambition, a boy who had grown into a man she no longer recognized. The weight of realization settled over Henry like a suffocating blanket, each breath becoming more difficult as the full scope of his blindness became clear. His mother had been here, in this very city, perhaps for years, and he had never known. She had touched Emily's life, had given her this painting, a piece of her own soul, and he had mocked it, had dismissed it as worthless trash from someone with no talent. The cruelty of his words echoed in his mind, each syllable a fresh wound that would never heal. He thought of all the galleries he had searched, all the high-end art shows where he had hoped to catch a glimpse of her work, never imagining that she might be creating beauty in quiet corners, giving her art away to those who needed hope more than money. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that his mother might choose simplicity over success, connection over recognition. Emily's voice cut through his anguish like a gentle blade, soft but insistent, as she asked the question that would change everything. "You knew her, didn't you? Lillian." The name fell from her lips like a prayer, and Henry's composure finally shattered completely. Tears he had held back for decades spilled down his cheeks as he nodded, unable to speak past the crushing weight of grief and regret. Emily's eyes widened as understanding dawned, the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed suddenly falling into place. The son Lillian had spoken of with such sadness, the successful businessman who had chosen money over family, who had broken her heart with his coldness. It was him. The man who had just humiliated her was the same person his mother had mourned for like the dead, the child she had lost to a world that valued profit over love. The cafe had fallen silent around them, other patrons sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding its true significance. Henry's empire, his carefully constructed world of power and control, meant nothing in the face of this revelation. He was no longer the feared CEO who could make or break careers with a word. He was simply a broken man who had spent half his life searching for someone who had been within reach all along. The painting in his hands felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed, more valuable than any deal he had ever closed. It was proof that his mother had continued to create, continued to love, continued to hope, even after he had driven her away with his relentless pursuit of success. The brushstrokes seemed to whisper accusations, each color a reminder of the beauty he had rejected in favor of cold, hard profit. Emily reached out tentatively, her fingers barely grazing his arm, as she offered the only comfort she could. She spoke of you often, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. She never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you would find your way back to her. The words hit Henry like physical blows, each one a reminder of the love he had thrown away, the mother he had abandoned in his quest to prove himself worthy of a father who had never deserved his devotion. Subscribe to discover where Lillian Blackwell disappeared to, and whether a son's desperate search can bridge 20 years of silence and regret. Emily's apartment was small and cluttered, filled with her own paintings and sketches that covered every available wall space, but Henry barely noticed the cramped quarters as she led him inside. His entire focus remained fixed on the painting he still clutched in his hands, as if letting go might cause his mother to disappear all over again. The afternoon light streaming through the single window illuminated the canvas differently here, revealing subtle details he had missed in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the cafe. There were layers upon layers of meaning in every brushstroke, a complexity that spoke of years of refined technique and emotional depth. His mother had always been talented, but this work showed a mastery that took his breath away, an evolution of skill that had happened during all the years he had been too proud to seek her out, too stubborn to admit he had been wrong. Emily moved around her small kitchen with nervous energy, preparing tea with shaking hands as she tried to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. She had loved Lillian like family, had treasured their long conversations about art and life, and the dreams that kept them both going through difficult times. The older woman had been her mentor, her confidant, her source of strength when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. Now she understood why Lillian's eyes had always held such deep sadness when she spoke of her son, why she had insisted that Emily never give up on the people she loved, no matter how far they seemed to drift away. The irony was almost too painful to bear. She had been the bridge between mother and son without ever knowing it, carrying Lillian's love and wisdom, while Henry searched desperately for any trace of the woman who had shaped both their lives. Henry's voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke, his words heavy with 20 years of accumulated grief and regret. "When did you last see her?" The question hung in the air between them like a fragile thread, and Emily's heart broke at the desperate hope she heard beneath his carefully controlled tone. She set down the teacup with trembling fingers, her mind racing back through months of memories, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when Lillian had simply vanished from her life. It had been gradual at first. Longer gaps between visits, conversations that seemed more urgent, as if the older woman was trying to say everything important before running out of time. Emily had attributed it to Lillian's advancing age, never imagining that her friend might be preparing for a final goodbye. The last conversation played in Emily's memory with crystal clarity, every word now taking on new significance in light of what she had learned. Lillian had been more emotional than usual, speaking with unusual intensity about forgiveness and the importance of never giving up on love, even when it seemed impossible. She had pressed the painting into Emily's hands with tears in her eyes, insisting that it belonged with someone who would understand its true value, someone who still believed in the power of art to heal broken hearts. "Promise me you'll keep creating," she had whispered, her voice urgent with an emotion Emily hadn't fully understood at the time. "Promise me you'll never let anyone convince you that beauty doesn't matter, that love isn't worth fighting for." The words had seemed like the ramblings of an elderly woman lost in nostalgia, but now Emily realized they had been a final message, a last attempt to pass on the wisdom that Lillian's own son had rejected. Henry's composure cracked further as Emily recounted that final meeting, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he had spent decades suppressing. He had been so close, had missed her by mere months, perhaps even weeks. While he had been sitting in his sterile office, making deals that meant nothing, his mother had been saying goodbye to the only person who had truly understood her art, her heart, her dreams. The painting in his hands felt like a lifeline and a condemnation all at once, proof that she had continued to love, continued to create, continued to hope for reconciliation, even as she prepared to disappear forever. He thought of all the private investigators he had hired, all the false leads he had followed, all the sleepless nights spent wondering if she was safe, if she was happy, if she ever thought of him with anything other than disappointment and regret. Emily watched him struggle with the weight of revelation, her own heart breaking for both the mother she had lost and the son who had found her too late. She moved to a small desk in the corner of the room, pulling out a worn envelope that she had kept without really knowing why. "She left this," Emily said softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of Henry's ragged breathing. "I never opened it. It felt too private, too personal. But maybe it was meant for you." The envelope was addressed simply to "My son," written in Lillian's distinctive handwriting, the letters slightly shaky with age, but still unmistakably hers. Henry's hands trembled as he reached for it, knowing that whatever lay inside would either offer him the closure he desperately needed or destroy what remained of his carefully constructed world. Subscribe to witness the moment when a mother's final words reach across the void of 20 years, carrying either forgiveness or a condemnation that will haunt him forever. Henry's fingers traced the envelope's edges with the reverence of a man handling a sacred relic, his breath coming in short, painful gasps as he struggled to find the courage to break the seal that had kept his mother's final words hidden for months. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible, and he could smell the faint trace of her perfume, lavender and vanilla, that had always clung to everything she touched. Emily retreated to the far corner of the room, giving him the privacy he needed for this moment of reckoning, but her presence remained a comfort, a reminder that his mother had found love and acceptance even after he had failed her so completely. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, heavy with anticipation and dread, as Henry finally summoned the strength to tear open the envelope that contained either his salvation or his final condemnation. The letter was written on her favorite stationery, cream-colored paper with tiny painted flowers along the border, the same paper she had used to write him birthday cards that he had barely acknowledged, Christmas notes that he had read with impatience, thinking them sentimental and unnecessary. Her handwriting was more fragile than he remembered, the letters slightly shaky with age or emotion, but the words themselves were strong, filled with a clarity and purpose that took his breath away. "My dearest Henry," it began, and already he could feel tears burning behind his eyes, threatening to spill over as he read the endearment he had taken for granted for so many years. She had never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping for reconciliation, even when he had made it clear that her presence in his life was an embarrassment, a reminder of a past he wanted to forget in his relentless pursuit of success and respectability. The letter continued with a gentleness that made his chest ache, each word carefully chosen to convey forgiveness rather than accusation, understanding rather than blame. She wrote of her pride in his accomplishments, her admiration for the man he had become, even as she mourned the boy she had lost somewhere along the way. "I know you think I left because I was disappointed in you," the letter read, "but the truth is far more complicated. I left because I could see that my presence was causing you pain, that every time you looked at me, you saw a reminder of everything you were trying to escape. I couldn't bear to be the source of your shame any longer, couldn't watch you struggle to balance your love for me with your need to fit into a world that had no place for a woman like me." The words hit him like physical blows, each sentence revealing the depth of his mother's sacrifice, the terrible price she had paid for his ambition. Emily watched from across the room as Henry's face crumpled with grief, his body shaking with the force of emotions he had suppressed for decades. She could see him reading and rereading certain passages, his lips moving silently as he absorbed the full impact of his mother's words. The letter was longer than she had expected, filled with memories and observations that painted a picture of a woman who had understood her son better than he had ever understood himself. Lillian had written about his childhood, about the sensitive boy who had cried over injured birds and spent hours creating elaborate stories with his toy soldiers, the child who had possessed such empathy and imagination before the world had taught him that those qualities were weaknesses to be overcome rather than gifts to be cherished. The most devastating part of the letter came near the end, where Lillian revealed the true reason for her disappearance. Not anger or disappointment, but a terminal diagnosis that she had chosen to face alone rather than burden her son with guilt and obligation. "I have cancer, my darling boy," she had written, the words stark and simple on the page. "The doctors say I have perhaps 6 months, maybe less. I could have told you, could have used my illness to force a reconciliation, but that would have been selfish and cruel. I want you to remember me as I was, not as a dying woman who manipulated your love through pity and fear. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I pray that you will find it in your heart to forgive an old woman's pride." The letter was dated 8 months ago, and Henry realized with crushing certainty that his mother was already dead, that his chance for reconciliation had died with her while he continued his futile search. The final paragraph was a benediction and a challenge, written with the wisdom of someone who had faced death with grace and courage. "I leave you my love, my forgiveness, and my hope that you will find your way back to the boy you once were, the child who saw beauty in everything, who believed in magic and possibility and the power of love to heal all wounds. Don't let my mistakes, or yours, define the rest of your life. Find someone to love, someone to create with, someone who will remind you that success without connection is just another form of poverty. Be happy, my son. That is all I ever wanted for you." Henry's vision blurred as tears finally spilled over, 20 years of suppressed grief pouring out of him in great, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Subscribe to discover how a son processes the devastating knowledge that his mother died alone, believing herself unloved while he searched the world for her forgiveness. Henry collapsed into Emily's worn armchair, the letter clutched against his chest, as if it could somehow bring his mother back, could undo 20 years of pride and stubbornness that had cost him everything that truly mattered. The weight of his grief was crushing, a physical force that made breathing difficult and thinking nearly impossible. Emily approached him cautiously, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, as she witnessed the complete destruction of a man who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable just hours before. She knelt beside his chair, her hand resting gently on his arm, offering the only comfort she could, the presence of someone who had loved his mother, who understood the magnitude of what he had lost. The afternoon light was fading outside her small window, casting long shadows across the room that seemed to mirror the darkness that had settled over Henry's soul. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of Henry's ragged breathing and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. Emily found herself thinking of all the conversations she had shared with Lillian, all the times the older woman had spoken of her son with such love and longing, such desperate hope that someday he would find his way back to her. She had painted him as a lost soul rather than a villain, a man who had been shaped by forces beyond his control, who had chosen success over happiness because he had been taught that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, seeing him broken and vulnerable, Emily could understand what Lillian had seen, not the arrogant CEO who had humiliated her in the cafe, but the frightened boy who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain. Henry's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely recognizable, hoarse with grief and stripped of all the authority and confidence that had defined him for so long. "She died alone," he whispered, the words falling from his lips like stones into still water, creating ripples of anguish that seemed to spread through the entire room. She died thinking I didn't love her, that I was ashamed of her, that she was nothing more than an embarrassment I wanted to forget. The truth of it was unbearable, a weight that threatened to crush what remained of his sanity. He had spent 20 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and influence, and none of it mattered now. None of it could bring back the woman who had given him life, who had loved him unconditionally, who had sacrificed her own happiness for his success. Emily's heart broke for both of them, for the mother who had died believing herself unloved, and for the son who would spend the rest of his life knowing that his pride had cost him the most precious thing in the world. She thought of her own relationship with her parents, strained though it was, and felt a surge of gratitude that she still had time to make things right, still had opportunities to say the words that mattered. "She knew you loved her," Emily said softly, her voice cutting through his despair like a gentle blade. "She told me once that love doesn't disappear just because it's not expressed, that the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. She carried your love with her always, even when you couldn't find the words to tell her." The words were meant to comfort, but Henry shook his head violently, rejecting any absolution that might ease his guilt. The painting sat propped against the wall where he had placed it, its colors seeming to glow in the fading light as if illuminated from within. Emily followed his gaze to the canvas, understanding instinctively what he was thinking, what he was seeing in those carefully crafted brushstrokes. "She painted it for you," she said quietly, the realization hitting her with sudden clarity. Not consciously, perhaps, but every stroke was an act of love, every color a prayer that someday you would see it and understand what she was trying to tell you. "She gave it to me because she knew I would treasure it, but also because she hoped. She hoped that somehow, some way, it would find its way to you." The idea was almost too painful to contemplate, that his mother had been reaching out to him even in her final months, creating one last bridge across the chasm that had separated them for so long. Henry stood abruptly, pacing to the window, where he stared out at the city that had consumed his life, the concrete jungle where he had built his kingdom of glass and steel and empty achievements. The view from Emily's apartment was nothing like the panoramic vista from his penthouse office, just a narrow slice of street, a few struggling trees, the everyday lives of ordinary people going about their business. But somehow it felt more real, more honest than anything he had seen in years. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the window as he struggled to process the magnitude of his loss. The terrible irony of finding his mother's final gift in the hands of a waitress he had tried to humiliate. Subscribe to witness the moment when a broken man must choose between the empire he built on pride and the chance to honor his mother's memory through love and redemption. The city lights began to twinkle below as evening settled over the urban landscape, each illuminated window representing a life, a story, a connection that Henry had never bothered to consider in his relentless pursuit of success. Emily moved quietly around her small apartment, lighting candles and preparing a simple dinner, her movements graceful and purposeful in a way that reminded him painfully of his mother. There was something healing about watching her work, about being in a space where creativity and compassion mattered more than profit margins and quarterly reports. The painting seemed to watch over them both, a silent guardian that carried the weight of love and loss, forgiveness and regret, hope and despair, all woven together in layers of oil and canvas that would outlast any corporate empire he might build. Henry turned from the window, his decision crystallizing with a clarity that surprised him after hours of anguish and confusion. The letter was still clutched in his hand, its edges soft with handling, and he read it once more, absorbing every word, every nuance, every expression of love that he had been too proud to accept when it might have mattered. His mother's final wish had been for him to find happiness, to rediscover the boy who had believed in beauty and magic and the transformative power of love. Standing in Emily's humble apartment, surrounded by her paintings and her kindness, he could feel that boy stirring to life again, awakening from a 20-year sleep induced by ambition and fear. The empire he had built suddenly seemed like a prison, a monument to everything his mother had tried to save him from becoming. Emily set 2 plates on her small table. The simple meal she had prepared, soup and bread, nothing fancy, somehow more appealing than any of the elaborate dinners he had consumed in 5-star restaurants. She moved with unconscious grace, her hands still stained with paint from her morning's work, her clothes simple but clean, her entire being radiating the kind of authenticity that he had forgotten existed. "I want to buy it," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "The painting. I want to buy it from you." Emily looked up in surprise, her spoon halfway to her mouth, and he could see the confusion in her eyes. "Not because I think you need the money," he continued quickly, "but because I need to do something, anything, to honor her memory. I need to make this right somehow." Emily set down her spoon carefully, her eyes never leaving his face as she considered his words. She could see the desperation there, the need to find some way to atone for 20 years of neglect and pride, but she also understood something that he didn't yet grasp, that his mother's gift couldn't be purchased, couldn't be owned in any conventional sense. "She didn't paint it to be sold," Emily said gently, her voice carrying the wisdom that Lillian had passed on to her during their long conversations about art and life and love. "She painted it to be shared, to be loved, to remind someone that beauty still exists in a world that often seems determined to destroy it. You can't buy that kind of gift, Henry. You can only receive it and pass it on when the time is right." Her words hit him like a revelation, stripping away another layer of the businessman's mentality that had governed his life for so long. The realization that followed was both liberating and terrifying. He didn't need to own the painting to honor his mother's memory. He needed to become the kind of person who could create something equally beautiful, equally meaningful, equally full of love. The empire he had built was impressive in its scope and power, but it was also cold, sterile, devoid of the human connection that his mother had valued above all else. Emily was still watching him, her eyes bright with understanding, and he could see that she recognized the transformation taking place within him, the slow awakening of a man who had forgotten how to feel, how to love, how to create something that mattered beyond the bottom line. The painting would remain with her, as his mother had intended, but its true gift, the reminder of what really mattered in life, would go with him. Henry reached across the small table and took Emily's paint-stained hand in his, the gesture feeling both foreign and completely natural. "Teach me," he said simply, his voice carrying a vulnerability that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "Teach me to paint, to create something beautiful, to see the world the way she did. I've spent 20 years building things that will crumble to dust, but she created something eternal. I want to learn how to do that. I want to become the son she believed I could be." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed his hand, understanding instinctively that this was more than a request for art lessons. It was a plea for redemption, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the man he had become and the boy his mother had loved. The painting watched over them both, its colors seeming to pulse with life in the candlelight, as if Lillian herself was blessing this unlikely connection between her son and the young woman who had carried her love forward into the world. Subscribe to discover whether a lifetime of ambition can be transformed into a legacy of love, and if a mother's final gift can teach her son the true meaning of success.